Support for this program provided by
About 23 miles northwest of Providence, Rhode Island, close to the borders with Connecticut and Massachusetts, within the town of Burrillville, lies the small village of Harrisville. Like so many small towns in this part of the Northeast, Harrisville has a story to tell. It is written along the main streets that cross through the center of town, in the buildings that line the roads, and in the hearts and the minds of the people who call this place home. The heartbeat of this community that was once kept by the rhythm of the looms and weaving machines has long been silenced. The textile industry has moved on. Many of the people who worked here have passed on as well. What remains here is more than memories. It is a legacy of a single man who dared to think differently, who ran a successful business and never compromised his heart. His name still hangs on the local elementary school, and his impact is everywhere in this community. On December 16, 1880, on the Lower East Side of New York City, the birth of a son was celebrated. His birth name was Austin Levy. His father was a German immigrant by way of France who worked as a cigar maker. His mother, Joanna, was a first-generation American, born in Brooklyn, New York. The couple had a 3-year-old daughter, Selma. Austin Levy, more than 20 years later, would add a middle initial to his name, a T, for Theodore. It was said he had done it because he was an admirer of President Theodore Roosevelt. More likely, it was done to honor his father, Theodore Levy, who had died when Austin was just 4 years old. Neither of his parents would live to see him grow to adolescence or witness his later success. Upon the death of his mother, when he was just 11, Austin and his sister moved in with an aunt. Like most young people in the late 1880s, Austin Levy's formal education was much less than is common today. Austin went to public school, graduating from Grammar School 69, and then spent a year at City College before leaving school at age 16. He immediately took a $3 a week job as an office boy for a New York City linen importer. Austin was ambitious and saw little future in remaining an office boy. His next job as a sales agent for a clothing manufacturer marked the beginning of an amazing life that would improve the lives of thousands of people in Rhode Island, the Bahamas, and around the world. 4 short years later, a 1900 U.S. census taker would record Levy's new title as salesman. As a salesman, his work involved substantial travel, visiting mills in New England, looking for quality textiles he could sell to cloth wholesalers and clothing manufacturers in New York. One of the mills he represented was Charles B. Rockwell's Namquit Mill in Bristol, Rhode Island. It was here, in 1905, that Levy met the mill's owner's pretty daughter, June. The Rockwell family traced their roots back to the Mayflower. They were intelligent, serious, and industrious New Englanders. Austin and June found an early bond in their mutual love of classical music. June played violin, and Austin was an accomplished violinist and violist. During his visits to Bristol, they often played music together. During their courtship, Austin Levy continued his travels between New England textile mills and his buyers and manufacturers in New York City. An experience Austin had with the production superintendent of one New England textile mill set the stage for a life-changing decision. Finding the quality of the mill's cloth not up to par and problems with delivery, he confronted the mill owner. As retold by Levy's biographer Louis Bleiweiss, Levy faced the mill owner with a bold ultimatum.
Either get yourself a new mill superintendent or a new selling agent.
There was no more discussion. Levy was out. The mill owner kept his superintendent and hired a new selling agent. Levy had just lost his biggest account. Rather than a failure, Levy considered it to be just the fire he needed to dream bigger. This temporary loss would soon lead him to begin a new career in textile manufacturing. In 1909, Austin T. Levy, the now 29-year-old woolen commission agent from New York City, leased a small textile mill in Greenville, Rhode Island from the Waterhouse family. The mill had just 40 weaving looms, but included dyeing and finishing facilities for the wool cloth the looms produced. He incorporated the business and named it Stillwater Worsted Company. Stillwater was the name of a small nearby village at the time. With hard work, his business grew. He soon needed more capacity to meet customers' orders. On January 1, 1912, at the age of 32, Levy began operations at a second mill leased from the Tinkham family in Harrisville, Rhode Island. In 1913, just 1 year after beginning operations, he moved to Harrisville to keep an eye on things. Levy also found his voice. He had opinions and ideas that he wanted to share with others in his industry and even beyond his industry. Beginning in late 1913, he gave the first of what would become a series of talks on industry, industrial relations, and better living.
Let me outline what an ideal business condition might be. I think you will agree that it would be an equally ideal condition for workers in any other field. By workers, I mean all those engaged in enterprise, whether they are employed by others or employ others, or pursue their enterprises individually.
Mr. Levy practiced his own teachings and continued learning the business as he went along, walking around his textile mills, talking with his workers, and listening to their ideas and suggestions to make the business better.
He was a family man, and it was a family community. The mill was like one big happy family, you know. I mean, he walked through there and not tiptoe around the dirty places and so forth, but he would talk to different people as he walked through the mill. You know people by name. I don't know, I can remember them all, but that's what he did.
He was one of the beloved people in our town. He was just a down-to-earth man, and if he saw you on the street, he knew your name. He knew everybody's name that worked for him.
If he saw something he didn't know about, he would simply ask. If he thought something could be better, he would modify it. As a result, he improved lighting, working conditions, and raised wages for workers. Levy had been very busy growing his company, but one piece of his life was still incomplete. It was hard to believe that nearly 10 years had passed since he first met June Rockwell. In June 1915, Miss June Rockwell and Austin Levy were married in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, in the home of the bride's sister.
He was interested in art and very advanced in his ideas about industrial relations. I guess he suddenly decided I could fit in. I said I must have worked for it. If you live in a small town with 13 old maids on every block, you have to work for a husband.
The Levys moved to a home in Harrisville following their marriage.
We bought this house because it was the only one with a bathroom. It was the most forlorn thing I had seen. The rooms were dark green and cinnamon. But he said he wouldn't remodel until proper housing was built for the people in the mill. There were no toilets in the houses next door, so the first thing he did was to build bathrooms in those houses. People call them the Levy's water closets.
With his marriage to June Rockwell came the most profound influence of his life. Ever after, she was his best friend, confidant, and partner in business, social life, and philanthropy.
I think Mrs. Levy was hand in glove with Mr. Levy. They were true partners.
My mother always told me that Mr. Levy felt so much in love with his wife. She had, I don't know if it was rheumatoid arthritis or something she had, but he had an elevator put in his home so she could go up and down the stairs. I thought that was wonderful.
World War I was raging in Europe, and the Stillwater Company prospered, producing cloth for uniforms. With this prosperity came innovations and improvements. The first innovation reflected the gentle influence of June Rockwell Levy and her lifelong passion for community health care when a full-time industrial nurse, one of the earliest in Rhode Island, joined the company. She would become involved in the area's local health care and beginning in 1920 would serve as president of the Burrillville-Gloucester District Nurses Association, a job title she would proudly hold for 51 years.
As a nonprofit entity, she and the fellow volunteer board members helped to guide the organization, establish the mission, and empowered the organization to carry out that mission through the use of employed staff.
Mrs. Levy felt very strongly that the community deserved good health care as well, and essentially formed the Northwest Community Nursing and Health Service, which served ultimately Burrillville and Gloucester, providing visiting nurse service that included service in the schools to children checking vision and hearing tests that were sponsored through them, but also allowing for nursing visits to people who were ill or disabled in their homes and were unable to get out to a physician.
She and her husband had a social conscience at a time where maybe it wasn't fashionable to have a social conscience. It wasn't done for publicity. It was done because of their belief systems and the recognition, as you had alluded to, that in order to have a successful business, the organization needed to have employees who were healthy and able to be productive and produce and weren't dealing with the variety of social issues of the time that may have impacted their productivity or their ability to come to work and be focused and productive.
The second innovation would also have far-reaching effects. With his mills running at full capacity, Levy called together his workers for a meeting, referring to them as his Stillwater family, to discuss his proposal to offer the company's first profit-sharing program.
For many, many years, it has been thought that when one man employed another, that those who employed and those who were employed had nothing in common. And so it became almost a custom for employers to pay as little as they had to. Now, our company has felt somewhat differently about this thing. We believe that if the company has prosperity, that the work people should share in that prosperity. We also believe that if every man and woman connected with the company has something to gain by increasing profits, that each one will do his utmost to make the profits as large as possible.
Did this profit-sharing plan work? 5 years later, speaking before the Plantations Club of Providence, Levy gave the answer.
All through the war, at no time did a machine in our mill stand idle for the need of a man to run it. Whether that was because of profit sharing or for some other cause, I cannot tell. But we think it is.
In 1918, the company launched its first important venture in community housing.
22 houses, and we lived in one while our house was being done over. Every house he built had to have 1 or 2 apple trees planted because he said children must have apples to eat and trees to climb.
Levy was aware that current wages were insufficient to enable a working man to occupy a new 7-room house. So, he based his rentals not on cost, but on what the prospective tenant's earnings enabled him to pay. As a result, there would be no direct profits from the homes, but Levy felt that the indirect returns more than justified the investment in providing his workers with access to first-class housing.
The homes that the people lived in, the mill houses, they weren't like a lot of the communities where they're all alike. If a man came in drunk, he would know which house was his. But Mr. Levy didn't have his houses like that.
The nicest buildings in this town are the ones that Mr. Levy built. And not only that, being the mill owner at that time, the mill owners used to have company houses. Well, he built an awful lot of beautiful homes in this village for the people. And it shows me because I had a chance to work in other places similar to this, and the buildings that they had for the help was nothing like the ones that Mr. Levy built here. They're real nice buildings that he built in this town. Even when you look at them today, they still look nice.
When the Levys were married in 1915, the bride's parents, who owned a house in Nassau in the Bahamas, invited the newlyweds to go there for their honeymoon. The Levys decided to postpone a sea voyage until they were better acquainted. 4 years later, they made their first trip together to Nassau. Seeing the beauty and tranquility of the Bahamas, Mrs. Levy thought it would be a good idea to have a winter home in Nassau to get her husband away for a yearly vacation. In 1920, a waterside property was purchased west of the city and a small house constructed. Later additions expanded the home size. The 1920s were a time of growth and expansion for the Stillwater Company. And even with an occasional new challenge, it was also an amazing time for the workers and their families, as Levy provided new benefits to his Stillwater family.
The first guy that comes your birthday, he hands you a nice new $5 bill.
In 1921, Levy completed the purchase of the Harrisville Mill from the Tinkham family. It became the first mill the company owned outright. It would not be the last. For his managers and workers in the mills, Levy launched a plan to bring some new cultural assets to the village of Harrisville.
He hired a man just for that purpose, to teach him tennis and so forth. And Herbert Stead, I guess his name was. Yes, that's what it was like. And that's what he did. He even taught the kids, too.
As well as being very interested in the arts, both Mr. and Mrs. Levy were musical. They played musical instruments. They took part in many evenings at their home where they would play with others who were talented musicians. And I think, again, the idea of promoting arts as a rich part of, or what should be a rich part of anybody's life experience was very important to both of them.
Following his and Mrs. Levy's love for classical music, Levy brought 3 world-class musicians to the village. They included Wassily Besikursky, virtuoso violinist of the Moscow Opera, Jacques Chouinard, first cellist of the Queen's Hall Orchestra in London, and Alexander Rim, pianist and composer. Together, these three musicians formed the professional Rhode Island Trio. They produced concerts and toured between Boston, Providence, and Harrisville. They also taught students in the town of Burrillville. Sunday evenings were devoted to quartet playing at the Levy House, with Levy playing the viola parts. Friends and neighbors were always in attendance. Levy was also an avid tennis player. He had built several tennis courts behind his Harrisville home and played well into his 60s. Additionally, Alexander Rim created and led the Harrisville Glee Club and produced concerts throughout the year. Finally, John Roland Hogue and later others were brought to Harrisville to lead and direct plays and musicals for a new dramatic society called the Village Players. Many wonderful productions were produced and staged in the Assembly Theater. Everything seemed to be going well when Levy suddenly faced labor troubles in the form of a demand for recognition of the Amalgamated Textile Workers of America. In spite of never having any previous wage demands in any of his mills, the union was calling for a strike. Levy gathered the employees together to outline the company's position.
Any man has the right to join a union or a club or anything else he sees fit to join. But no man has the right to force another man to join a union or a club or anything else. In other words, the rights and beliefs of every individual must be respected.
The strike occurred anyway, but both Levys were in agreement that no matter the cost to them and their personal assets, they would not give in to the demand that all employees be forced to join the union. Of the 320 people in the mill, 140 did not walk out. But to prevent any reprisals against these employees, Levy ordered the mill closed for 30 days. After 30 days, the mill reopened and the 140 returned. Reactions were few, stones thrown, names called, but in the end the community came to Levy's rescue. New people were trained and got the mill operating again at full capacity. Levy never again had any labor trouble, and because he paid the best wages and provided the best working and living conditions, none of his mills were ever unionized.
Mr. Levy was a man much ahead of his time in labor relations, certainly. He believed that his mill workers should not just benefit from their labors by getting a salary, but that they should be allowed to have a portion of the proceeds. They were allowed to buy stock or get grants of stock, which made them a part owner of the company and therefore ensured pretty much that they were going to do their very best for that company if they were working for themselves to some degree. He believed in that so strongly, he went to Congress to try to change Congress' outlook on labor relations. He wasn't terribly successful at his persuading them to do what he had done.
In 1924, Levy offered his employees stock ownership in the company, providing them another way to benefit along with the prosperity of the company. In 1925, Levy completed the purchase of the Greenville Mill, where he had started his business in 1909. 2 mills were acquired in Mapleville in 1926. While the company needed more production capacity, Levy felt that adding more population to the village of Harrisville would not be prudent and would compromise the very rural nature of the area. Levy instead sought to look outside the village and thus decentralize the company, including purchasing and expanding the Bethel Mill at Ashaway, located in the southern part of Rhode Island. In 1925, he built a new mill in East Woodstock, Connecticut. This was an experiment by Mr. Levy to see if he could build a prospering economy surrounding a mill which would coexist with the local agriculture. He wanted to build a community in the middle of nowhere and make it thrive upon its own resources. It was, in effect, an experiment for the future. Later, in 1928, He constructed 3 new mills in Virginia, again with the idea of seeing what, if any, operational advantages there might be in the South. All of the mills were successful. In spite of the 1929 stock market crash, all of the company's existing and new mills continued to operate throughout the Great Depression. Employment averaged 48 weeks a year throughout the 1930s, and the company made money every year.
During the Depression, he kept the mills running here, and that meant that these people had jobs, and that was a real bad time. I remember growing up, I didn't realize how bad it was then, but I look back on it now, and it seemed like nobody had anything, and so we were very fortunate that Mr. Levy kept these mills operating here.
He kept everybody working right through the Depression.
For a man to take that much interest in this town, you know, most people would run away from it, but he stuck it out, and I'm talking about him now because of that. He's a good man.
2 more Rhode Island mills, one each in Glendale and Nasonville, were purchased during this time. There was no further expansion of the company's business in the South. In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, Mr. and Mrs. Levy presented the town council with a very generous offer. The offer proposed that the Memorial Block building be torn down and several buildings be erected in its place and donated to the town. These town buildings would include a new library, town hall, courthouse, modern assembly theater, and several renovations to area churches. The properties would be built on adjoining pieces of land and would make up a colonial-style town square. The town council found no reason to deny the gift, so it was voted on and approved. Mr. Levy also established a board of administration to oversee the maintenance and operation of the new buildings in perpetuity, and he provided a generous endowment for their upkeep. Today, the Board of Administration is still operating and successfully carrying out the terms of the original deed for these properties.
Mr. Levy was concerned that there were a number of older buildings that were being used for various town offices, a library, and sort of movie house, if you will, or production area where people could put on plays in the Harrisville area. And he was very concerned about the physical state of some of those buildings. He felt that it was important to have a local seat of government that looked like it befitted government being important. And so he made arrangements to buy some of the properties and to tear them down and to build new edifices in their place that very much resembled a sort of Williamsburg colonial look that at the time was considered a classic look for New England.
Levy engaged the architectural firm of Jackson, Robertson, and Adams to design the new brick colonial revival-style civic buildings. Following the demolition of the Memorial Building, construction began with the assembly in 1933, remodeling of the steeple, and the entrance of the Universalist Church in 1933. The town building in 1934, the 9th District Courthouse in 1934, and a new Jesse M. Smith Memorial Library in 1937. Later, he would build and donate a new high school building and move an adjacent river a few hundred feet to accommodate a full-size baseball field for the school. He did things right, and today, all of these buildings are still in productive use. In 1936, Stillwater acquired the Glendale Mill. Shortly afterward, Levy, with his architects, began construction of 30 one-story houses just outside the village proper that became known as Glendale New Village. Throughout his life, Levy was adamant that the economy could be improved by raising wage rates. He was a familiar face in Washington, D.C., where he testified numerous times before legislative committees. On June 10, 1937, he spoke to the Joint Labor Committee on a proposed wages and hours bill.
I am in favor of maximum hours to be determined by the facts of employment in the United States. I do not object to a minimum wage. Only make it high enough. But get the employment going and have it so steady that people may confidently count on it from year to year.
Mrs. Levy was successful at managing an annual winter break for her husband at their home in Nassau on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. But their annual retreat was not all rest and relaxation. Mrs. Levy's lifelong interest and concern with community health care and nutrition led her to become a founder of the Infant Welfare Association in Nassau in 1924. About 50 miles east of the Levy home in Nassau is the island of Eleuthera. This long and narrow, predominantly working-class island is mostly known as a destination for those interested in natural beauty and history. In an area known as Hatchet Bay, just off the main road that crosses the island, are the remains of a once thriving poultry and dairy business. The lack of a local supply of affordable fresh milk in Nassau had drawn the attention of Austin Levy, who quickly embraced the challenge of developing island agriculture to supplement continuing food shortages, improve the nutrition of the Bohemians, and reduce the nation's dependence on costly food imports. In 1936, he purchased 2,000 acres of land at Hatchet Bay on the island of Eleuthera, located 52 miles east of Nassau. He began agricultural experiments to see what would grow on the island, began keeping weather records, and started a new business, the Harrisville Company, to organize all the many facets of this new venture. His Stillwater Worsted Company was booming in Rhode Island, yet here he was in the Bahamas at the age of 57 with the idea of growing crops, raising cows and chickens, and addressing the need for fresh milk and better nutrition for island children and their families. Levy's decision to develop an agriculture operation on Eleuthera required a massive effort.
During the time of growing up in this community, it was almost like, compared to all of the rest of the Bahamas, it was almost like growing up in a city. On Saturdays, growing up as a little boy, we had the opportunity to go to the grocery store out front that was owned by the Levys. And in the process of going through primary school, visitation opportunities came to us as school trips, where we would have trips that would take us to the chicken farms that was built by Mr. Levy. It was just an amazing, and as a little boy, I still have that memory right now stuck within my head, seeing it all.
Mostly just giving jobs to the people.
In Nassau, evidence of Austin T. Levy and the presence of the Harrisville Company still exist. Many of the more than 20 milk stands that were located on prime corner locations in every neighborhood of the city are still in place. The Harrisville Company in Nassau built and managed the milk stands where residents could easily walk and purchase fresh milk, eggs, chicken, and ice cream, all products of the Harrisville Company in Hatchet Bay on the island of Eleuthera.
As a little girl, we lived through Balls Alley at the end of the corner. I lived with my grandfather, great-grandmother, and their grandchildren. And especially on Saturdays, we'd get a treat. And so my grandfather always gave us an allowance to come down to get cream. We called it cream in that day when we were referring to ice cream. And so we'd come down to this milk stand where they sold eggs, ice cream, chicken, milk especially. And we would buy ice cream, especially on a Saturday. And it was always such a great treat. Back in the 1950s, early 60s, or even like the late 1940s, hardly anybody had electricity or refrigeration. So it was a treat to come and get ice cream on a Saturday because you had no fridge. Everyone bought ice. But when you came down to these places, you could get fresh eggs, you can get the ice cream, you could either get it in a cup or a box.
The whole neighborhood was aware of the milk stand. Again, in my childish memory, I don't think I associated the milk stand with Levy, but the idea was the milk stand was a very important part in the daily activities of all the residents of the area I grew up in. There's no doubt of the importance of the milk stand to our community. To get chicken, you had to go to the milk stand. And as I said, we went to the milk stand often.
Back in Rhode Island, Austin Levy was taking care of business at home. The great sales and profits of 1937 led him to declare a 2-week paid vacation for his workers with 4 weeks of pay. It was one of the first in the nation.
I'll give you 4 weeks pay and 2 weeks vacation. That was never heard of before.
The first 2 weeks of July would be everybody, between those 2 weeks, would have their vacation. And that's when everybody would head to Old Orchard Beach, Maine. You would more or less run into everybody you knew from the mill up there on vacation.
Prospective vacationers were told they would find that it takes 4 weeks pay to have a good 2 weeks vacation. A temporary travel agency was set up in the company offices so people could plan a vacation. Most had never had one. Some people decided to keep working and saw the vacation money as a way to do some other things they had put off. A young expectant mother said she was going to have her baby in the way she wanted, in a hospital. One mill worker used his vacation pay to put a proper tombstone on his mother's grave. In the neighboring village of Pasco, Austin Levy funded and oversaw the construction of the Frank H. Potter Bridgeway that finally resolved the traffic problems in the village and recognized a favored resident by bestowing the modern span with his name. As busy as he was with his Stillwater mills in Rhode Island and his recent startup of the Harrisville Company in the Bahamas, he was recruited to manage the 1938 Republican state campaign for Rhode Island governor. Austin Levy was a lifelong Republican, loved politics, and had been elected chairman of the Burrowville Republican Town Committee in 1936. The 1938 candidate for governor was William H. Vanderbilt. He benefited from a well-known family name, and with Levy's guidance, he easily won the election. On August 24, 1942, Levy issued a simple statement.
Stillwater Worsted Mills will change its corporate name to Harrisville Combing Company and will sell those plants to a new corporation under the name of Stillwater Worsted Mills, Incorporated.
The full scope of Levy's simple statement and its impact on employees would take a while to take effect. The purchasers and new owners of the company were the managers and workers at Stillwater Worsted. The employee stock ownership plan that Levy created in 1924 was the basis for the transaction, and the employees' producers' common stock, now worth $700,000, became the down payment for the purchase. The sale price included 11 mills and more than 1,000 acres of land, and hundreds of homes and other outbuildings. With his announcement and the sale of the company to his Stillwater company family, Levy relinquished all connection to the company he founded and had grown to success. He would not own even one share of the new company, nor become a member of its board of directors. Every share of the company was to remain in the hands of the employee stockholders. The question on everyone's mind was, why did he do it?
As a man goes on in life, there comes a time when he begins to slip. He doesn't know it. His friends don't tell him. But if he stays on in a business of which he has been the mainspring, he ruins the business. The well-being of a business employing 2,000 people is important not only to those directly employed, but to their families and to the communities which depend on them as well. Probably 10,000 to 12,000 people are closely affected by the fate of such a business. It is important, therefore, that as they grow older, men who head such enterprises give some thought and make some provisions against the days when their own activities must lessen and finally cease. After all, people do not own wealth. They are merely custodians of it during their lifetimes.
Levy was quick to tell the new owners that he would not be a mother-in-law to them. They were free to make their own decisions, but he cautioned them.
As you prosper, so must your people.
Levy was delighted the business would continue.
Nothing in my lifetime has given me greater satisfaction than this evidence that the group which I was privileged to head for so many years will carry on in the tradition which they helped to create.
Even as the company was changing hands, World War II had everyone's focus now. Demand for cloth was increasing. At the same time, more and more young men from the Stillwater Company were drafted into military service and sent for training before being shipped off to bases around the world. Now led by Mr. Levy's longtime head of production, Marcus Thompson, the company quickly decided it would continue supporting their workers who had left to fight the war. First, Stillwater guaranteed everyone a job to return to once the war ended. Second, company employees began putting together care packages to send to their work colleagues in the services. Finally, the company began publishing a magazine, the Stillwater News, with photos and articles about the goings-on in the mills, and including news of employees serving in the armed services. The magazine, completely written and produced by employees, was sent with care packages that included magazines, cigarettes, chewing gum, and other notions. The Stillwater News was a sweet spot, and soon letters came from around the globe, from former mill workers clamoring for more news while sharing news of their activities helping to fight the war. The company also remembered the birthdays of their employees and sent each one a check to commemorate their special day while they were far away from home.
Dear Mr. Thompson.
Dear Mr. Thompson.
Dear Mr. Thompson. I want to thank you again for the kindness you've shown to me.
I want to thank the Stillwater Worsted Mills for the fine gifts that they have sent me. I certainly have appreciated every one of them.
It is sure swell that you people remember us in the service.
The main reason I am writing is to thank you ever so much for the check that you sent me for my birthday.
The sort of friendship you're extending is constantly widening the road of determination and makes us feel proud to have been a member of your firm.
The cigarettes, the paper, and the Reader's Digest are all swell.
I believe the printing of the Stillwater News was a wonderful thing for the company to do.
That is a grand little paper.
We hope it won't be long before we'll be back. Sincerely, George L. Servitt.
Yours very truly, Carlton F. Brown.
As ever, Beverly Collins.
Sincerely yours, Enoch T. Steer.
Sincerely, Charles W. Saltonstall.
June and Austin Levy continued pursuing their own interests in healthcare and music. They began commuting back and forth to the Bahamas whenever it was safe to do so, keeping an eye on their growing Eleuthera plantation and the Harrisville Company's operations in Jacksonville, Florida, Nassau, and Hatchet Bay on Eleuthera. The plantation now played a key role in providing employment and feeding people in the Bahamas during the war.
You had a job. You had a job there, and you had everything at hand. You had your eggs, your chickens, your dairy products and stuff like that.
Hatchet Bay became one of the center of attractions in this country because of the poultry farm and the Harrisville Company. The Harrisville Company made a lot of things happen in this place.
Those days was good. Mr. Levy did something for Hatchet Bay and even other parts of the Bahamas.
In the morning time, when it was time for the folks to go to work, you'd hear the siren go off. That's so you say, oh, well, it's time to go to school, but it was time for people to go to work. That was indicated that we go to school. When we're in school, we could always tell when people are knocking off at 4 o'clock. You hear the siren again. In fact, you hear it 3 times a day, morning, noon, and in the evening time. All of those things was like adrenaline. You felt like you were part of something, a part of a place that was growing rapidly.
I wish the days would come back.
Mr. Levy on several occasions met the former King of England, now Duke of Windsor, at Government House in Nassau. The Duke had expressed admiration for the agriculture work being achieved on Eleuthera. Levy invited the Duke to visit him in Harrisville on his next trip to the United States. In August 1944, the Duke of Windsor arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, on the first stop of a U.S. visit. Upon arrival, he was reported to have asked to be taken to meet with Austin T. Levy in Harrisville. And so it was that on a fine summer day, the workers and managers and residents of Harrisville witnessed the arrival and visit of the Duke of Windsor. The Levys continued to find ways to give and to improve their hometown. In 1949, the June Rockwell Levy Foundation announced a gift of $40,000 to the U.S. government for the construction of a new U.S. post office in Harrisville. The new building was completed and dedicated the following year. Perhaps not so surprisingly, it took an act of Congress for the government to accept this first-of-its-kind gift from a private citizen. In July of 1950, the Republican Party asked Levy to run as party nominee for United States Senator from Rhode Island. Levy consulted Rhode Island friends and colleagues who advised him to stay out of the race. His out-of-state friends saw it more objectively and supported his run. His wife also supported his nomination, and she held the deciding vote. Levy explained his own reasoning for going forward.
If I am sent to Washington, I shall carry with me a determined interest in the things for which I have worked through the years, the well-being of a self-reliant people and the fulfillment of our nation's destiny. It is my conviction that our country's future can only be assured through the prosperity, happiness, and economic independence of the great mass of the people.
The election was held, and the powerful Democrat Party machine turned out the voters for their candidate. Levy, who had long kept a low profile, was unknown in the urban areas where most of the votes were cast. As a result, Governor Pastore won big. Despite the loss and its draining effect on his strength, Levy showed no signs of disappointment. He was hopeful that his work to unify the state's Republicans during his campaign would serve to launch future victories for the party. The Levys returned to Nassau, intent on a long rest. But as always, there were proposals to be prepared, projects to be considered, and plans to be made. A plan for a new post office in Pasco, Rhode Island was on the drawing board. The next year, a state-of-the-art indoor ice skating rink at the Burrillville High School would be discussed.
Burrillville High School had achieved both local and regional fame for its caliber of its hockey teams. And I told them that I thought it would be a wonderful idea if we had a rink, an indoor rink, so that we wouldn't have to wait for the ice to freeze on some of our local ponds so the teams could practice. But unfortunately, Mr. Levy took sick on that Thanksgiving Eve of 1951. He passed away. Mrs. Levy called me a short time after the funeral, and I went to her home, and she said she would see to it that the June Rockwell Levy Foundation funded that rink.
In August 1951, Levy went into a New York hospital for a checkup and stayed 6 weeks. He went back for a second examination several weeks later. On November 2nd, he entered Jane Brown Hospital in Providence. The diagnosis was an inoperable brain tumor. At 1 p.m. on November 24, 1951, Austin T. Levy's heart was stilled. Telegrams, cables, letters, cards, and messages of sympathy came from England and the Bahamas, from New York to Boston, from throughout the United States, and from textile centers of the world. In Burrillville, there was disbelief, shock, and unbearable grief as people heard the news. Despite a cold, sweeping wind, an estimated 2,000 people from all walks of life lined up outside to pay their last respects to Harrisville's beloved industrialist and humanitarian. The eulogy was given by the eminent historian Jonathan M. Steer of Harrisville and Haverford, Pennsylvania.
Austin T. Levy was a successful businessman, a statesman, and humanitarian. His hobby was people. His humanitarian life was not that of a world reformer, rather, his great interest in life remained with his next-door neighbor. He loved Harrisville, and in doing the many building projects, he believed people should have better living and good health. We should not be sad, but glad that a man of his caliber lived among us.
Mrs. Levy went on to fulfill the goals she and her husband had shared and nurtured over more than 3 decades. In 1953, the new Pasco Post Office was dedicated and given to the U.S. government. A new $60,000 health center for the Burrillville Gloucester District Nursing Association was dedicated in Pasco in 1953. The Levy Medical and Health Center was dedicated in Governor's Harbor on Eleuthera in March 1963. Mrs. Levy had contributed $85,000 towards its construction. In June of 1963, the Queen of England officially recognized her work in the Bahamas and proclaimed her to be an officer of the British Empire, Civil Division. Later, an enormous indoor ice skating rink was built next to the Burrillville High School, funded by the June Rockwell Levy Foundation and named in her honor. For the rest of her life, she would live 6 months in Europe and divide the rest of her time between her homes at Harrisville and Nassau and Hatchet Bay. In the autumn of her life, recognition and honors would come to her and her late husband. In June 1967, Mrs. Levy, declared as First Lady of Burrillville by official action of the Burrillville Town Council, was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Rhode Island in recognition of her humanitarian and philanthropic endeavors. On the evening of May 7, 1969, she and her late husband were inducted into the Rhode Island Hall of Fame. In 2001, they were both inducted into the Burrillville Athletic Hall of Fame. Their longtime friend and Levy biographer Louis Bleiweiss talked about his friends and the impact on the community they shared and loved.
They loved this town, they made it their home. Because of Mr. Levy's involvement in the athletic field and all that, and his intense interest in the community, he was elected to the Burrillville High School Hall of Fame, and so was Mrs. Levy, because she carried out what he started as far as getting the rink.
On September 14, 1953, on a grassy spot behind the Assembly Theater that overlooks Harrisville Pond, there was held a quiet dedication ceremony and unveiling of a plaque honoring the life of Austin T. Levy. The location was one he had chosen himself many years before. Raymond Daggett, then just 6 years old, remembers a conversation Mr. Levy had with him about this location.
He used to come up here every once in a while, not that often, but he used to come up here because he told me that the view here, looking down at the pond and the trees, and he told me to him it was the most beautiful place in the world.
Following her passing in 1971 at the age of 85, Mrs. Levy's ashes were buried in this place next to those of her husband. In 1984, the Harrisville Historic District was named to the National Register of Historic Places, a fitting recognition of the Levy's building gifts and transformation of the village during the 1930s. The philanthropic efforts of Austin T. and June Rockwell Levy through their June Rockwell Levy Foundation continue today, more than 80 years after they first created this permanent fund to encourage and support the people and communities they love so much.
Support for this program provided by